Welcome, everyone. This is Magic and Mountains,
the T.A. Barron podcast.
Patricia Lee Gauch was editorial director of Philomel Books, now a division of Penguin, for almost 25 years. She holds a doctorate in English literature. She's taught writing and children's literature on the college level. She has reviewed for the New York Times and other publications. Patti has also edited 3 Caldecott books: Owl Moon by Jane Yolen, illustrated by John Schoenherr, Lon Popo by Ed Young, and So You Want to Be President by Judith St. George, illustrated by David Small. And on top of all that, she has worked with many well-known artists and authors, including people like Eric Carle, Patricia Polacco, Brian Jakes, and, some guy out in Colorado named T.A. something. In addition to her work as an editor, Patti has also written 39 books of her own, among them Thunder at Gettysburg, This Time, Christina Katerina and the Box, and Dance Tanya. This I will say, Patti Gauch loves to ask, through storytelling, the deepest, most profound questions about life. And I can also testify from experience that, Patti, you are absolutely relentless in urging your writers to rise to their very highest levels. And the result is this: any book that has the name Patricia Lee Gauch, whether as writer or editor, promises to be a treasure, an enduring source of light. So I am just thrilled to be here with you, Patti.
It was lovely that you thought of it. I thought to myself, that's quite wonderful.
Well, I think an appropriate place to start would be where it all began for you, your love of stories and your love of characters and places and big ideas. I can't help but imagine you as a child in Michigan, outside, barefoot, sitting under a tree, reading a book. Tell us about how your love of books and stories happened.
That's a really good question. A very real memory of mine was I had a library that used to be a candy store. And I would go with my red wagon up to the candy store turned library, and I would pack my wagon with as many books as the librarian. And of course, I would sneer at her because she tried to limit me, and I was not happy with that. And I'd pack them in, and I would pull them home. But before I got home, I always stopped at a tree nearby and sat on the roots of the tree, and I would start reading them. So it started there, and it's one thing to read, and I loved reading. I particularly, incidentally, loved all of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, and I cried when the last one came. But at the same time, what's interesting for us, Tom, is that I used to read fairy tales, and I can remember, I must have been 7 or 8 years old, saying to myself, this one is a good tale. This one is not a good tale. Something is missing in this story, and I was not satisfied with certain fairy tales. So this was when I was 7 or 8 years old.
You're still at the age you're towing that little red wagon, practically. But you're noticing what is a story that really lands with you.
Yes.
Tell us more about that, Patti. What do you think it was?
Well, I think I look at books of all ages spatially. So I could almost describe a book spatially. I could say that it's an arc, or I could say that a third of the way through, I feel there's a rise to it. I feel like a little bit further on, there needs to be characters meeting each other, doing something. So I have a very spatial approach to editing, not that I designed it that way, but I feel it that way. And where I feel it really is in the back of my neck. So I'm listening to myself. I'm listening to my own body when I read a book. So when I used to read your manuscripts, I was reading it with that in mind. I was listening to myself.
And I remember so many times when we were sitting in your garden room at your home or out in the meadow at our cabin up in the mountains, and you would draw a chart. You would draw that arc and make points along the way where you wanted to emphasize suspense or tension, or maybe inject a little humor or slow the pace down for a breath, things like that.
I think that's exactly right. Sometimes there's no other way to say, look, you're not earning your ending, for example. You're not earning it. What that means is the part before the ending has energy in it. You've taken your character, in this case it would be Merlin, you've taken your character and you want it to get to that climax, but you have to earn it. You're not ready for that climax yet. So as an editor, that's one of my jobs, is to make certain, in a sense, that the middle is right, that the beginning is right, and that always, always you write with passion. If ever I hear boredom, if ever I hear a plateauing, I probably won't tolerate it. I'll say, you can't do that to yourself. I can hear the wind in your sails. I know you travel with the wind, right? But you need more here.
Patti, you just reminded me that the English Romantic poets used the metaphor of the wind in a different way. They thought about Aeolian harps, which, as you know, are set outside, and their strings are made to make music by the sound of the wind moving the strings. And I remember reading somewhere that one of the Romantic poets, I think it may have been Coleridge, said that he likes that because the goal of poetry is to find the right language that would vibrate in the strings of the human heart.
I appreciate what you just said. I was looking through my notes preparing to come today, and I was drawing an analogy between you and the wind. And I was thinking to myself, he writes like the wind. And he just lets it, you know how the wind is. The wind blows across the pane, or the wind blows into a valley, or a wind kind of circles around a bush or whatever. And that's the way I felt when I was rereading some of your books in the last few days. And I thought, he writes like the wind. And he lets wherever he is, take it somewhere. So a phrase that I use very often is, are you going far enough? And so what I was seeing and remembering is that because you write like the wind, you often go far enough. Yeah.
Wow. I love that image. And, it becomes that way, doesn't it, when you're immersed in the writing process? I feel like I can't write fast enough when it all comes together. At the same time, I would also add that writing is both the hardest labor and the most meaningful labor that people like us get to do. We have to really be engaged with both sides of our brain, and all of our passion and our intellect have to be fully there and aware of who are these characters? How do we bring them to life? What does their voice sound like? What are their deepest secrets? And also the same with place. That's one of the realms that you and I have always had fun exploring and taking farther. I think we both see place as a form of character.
I was just going to say, I think place, when it's well done, is a character. And you could call it a character because there's a breath to it. It has real moment. You don't very quickly say, oh, that was a little red schoolhouse. That's just not what place means. Place resonates. I think that was something that you always understand and understood. And Tom, that has old roots. There is a closeness between fantasy and the natural world. And so it was something that C.S. Lewis discovered, George MacDonald discovered, these authors, that there's this strange symbiotic relationship between place and character, particularly in fantasy.
Tolkien too, right?
Tolkien, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's not accidental, because the first origins of magic were in observing the natural world. and feeling wonder at the motion of water or the flight of clouds or a bird on high or a night full of bright stars, an ancient forest. All of these convey wonder and magic. And how does that happen? How do the seasons come back? How does the moon keep refilling itself and then disappear? All of these kinds of questions. That's the origin of magic. And that's the first step toward fantasy.
It's also, not everybody sees that. Not everybody hears that. It has occurred to me that writers of fantasy, the best fantasy, are always looking for transcendence. They're always looking to take flight. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the author is willing to go to that place, is willing to let go to transcendence, willing to say, look, that's reality too. I love the idea of you reaching for the stars and how often in your books you reach for the stars or you reach for the constellations. Yeah, so that's a gift of you personally, and of course other people as well, but it is certainly, I think, a mark of your work.
Patti, we've often talked about the idea that good fantasy, good storytelling must be true. And to some people, that sounds paradoxical. How can made-up imaginative stories be true? But could you talk a bit about what that means to you?
You know, it's interesting because it might go back farther than you think. There are people who believe in the collective unconscious, right? Like Jung, Joseph Campbell. And they believe that there is a kind of story well. Why is a story in Fiji almost the same as a story in Switzerland? What's going on? What do we share as human beings in some kind of a story well? So there is that in us, kind of a genetic story well. And if we let go to it, if we believe in it, we can pluck it out. We can say, I feel that, I hear that. I think not everybody can do it. Not everybody recognizes that it's there. But I like to think of it as a well, a story well.
I love that. And that's part of why stories connect all people of all cultures and across all times. Think about that for a moment. That's just an incredible power embedded in story. I love your image of the well. In fact, it reminds me that sometimes you've talked about the emergence of story as having to do with going into the belly of the whale.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that metaphor?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure where the beginning of it started, but it's an archetypal. It's something that you see over and over in stories, and you say, oh my God, there it is again. When an author takes you into a cave, an author takes you into the belly of the whale. The author takes you into this place that, of course, if you think about it, is a lot like where an embryo forms, right?
It's
a
womb.
lot. Absolutely.
Yes.
So once again, the author is trying to give this little character or this big character a chance to live and to grow. And so once again, think for just a minute of Pinocchio. I'm sure that the author of Pinocchio, Collodi, I guess, did not realize how archetypal he was. But look where Pinocchio ends. He goes through all of the tests of human beings. He accepts the call to adventure. He meets the fox. He meets the blue fairy. He meets Jiminy Cricket. He meets the island of the toys. And when he's earned, there's that word earned again, he's earned the climax of his story, then he can go to the edge of the cliff and jump. And he's jumping back into reality. And what gets him? The whale.
You just gave me shivers. That's terrific.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah. It is amazing. Yeah.
Now, this is part of why stories can carry our biggest ideas, why all peoples of all descriptions have embedded their biggest moral precepts, their biggest questions about life inside stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know what I like to think of? I like to use the word soul, Because it's one thing to think that you're well, right? Your story well, and you're well, the story stores images, and it's a wonderful choice of the details you pick. But when you think to yourself, wait a minute, that well is something of a soul. And once you use the word soul, then you have your ideas in it. You have your values in it. It's who you are. Here you are at a certain age, and it's the composite of what you have become at the age you are. So now you're the writer. Now you're going to sit down and you're going to write your story. You're aching to use what's in your soul because that's the impassioned part of yourself, the impassioned, thoughtful part of yourself. And I was checking some of your books, and it's amazing to me how much wisdom there is in your books. So there's great adventure, but there's great wisdom in your books. And that, I think, came from your well. It came from your soul.
Patti, you make me realize that the writer of a story has to dive deep, deep, deep down into that well. And at the same time, by the way, reaching high up to the stars. So
Yep.
it's boundless reach. But you have to go there as a writer before you can bring readers into those deep or high places, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You have to risk it, don't you?
Yeah, that's part of how you earn it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And there's something about Tom always writes with a pen or a pencil.
Right.
And am I right, Tom? You get something from that.
I do. It slows me down, perhaps, but I feel an elemental chemistry there with pen and paper where characters really speak to me. I really hear their voices. And it has a pace and a description. And as I hear it in my mind, I'm writing as fast as I can or crossing out or doing the old-fashioned version of cut and paste
Yeah.
and rearranging things. And then I rewrite it, copy it in a better form, as if I'm telling the story out loud. And that's when I really feel, okay, that's a story coming together here. Now, as we both know, it's still going to take 7, 8, 9 more drafts before it's really done, but it's on the way. It's like the flour and the molasses and the butter and the rest that's in your bread is in the bowl, and you have to knead it and then let it rise and knead it again and ultimately bake it, and it will be wondrous. But the ingredients are in there.
I'm going to expand on what you said just a little bit. Not everybody agrees with this, but I think there's something in a first draft that you need to be careful to save. In other words, something that comes out of that well, and we've just discussed how magical that well is. So something comes out of that, and you write it down, and maybe it's a paragraph, maybe it's a character, but all of a sudden you as the author and perhaps the editor sees that and sees, you don't want to lose that. So there are writers that I think come in ready to rewrite, and they fail to realize, and scared by the word first draft, they fail to realize that there's stuff in the first draft that you need to protect. It's like a baby, and it's soft and gentle. You need to be careful because it's quite wonderful.
Oh, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the heart of the matter. There is a baby in there. And also, I think getting through that first draft has helped me get clarity on what is that baby? What is that seed that I need to guard and protect and nurture so it's going to grow into a wonderful being of its own?
Yeah. Yep. It's something else I've recognized maybe almost in recent years is that a novel is made up of magnificent little scenes. It's not one continuous scene. It's these wonderful nuggets, these scenes that go almost to experience itself. So they're created by concrete images and vital words, and there's a tremendous amount of energy in them. And if you look at a whole novel, you'll say, there's that patch of energy. Oh my God, we went there. You went there. And so there is a certain amount of protective mantle in the artist and the author, taking care of what's there and nurturing it. And that doesn't always mean polishing it.
That's so true. You're hinting at the mystery that is embedded in this process too, right?
Absolutely.
I feel a deep humility to be in this realm where there's so much power, so many important principles and useful tools, but there's also always, always, always that element of a mysterious wellspring of wisdom and heart that comes from somewhere so deep we can't even name it.
Yeah. Isn't it wonderfully said? It's a wellspring. Tom, when we were writing the bulk of your early books, we would go to your cabin, and it had a long window at the end of it, of this room that we were in. And so you'd get in these soft, comfy chairs, and you'd look out the window, and you would see wildflowers just blowing in the wind. They were tall and lovely, and all of it sort of freed one. But I think there was a sense of mission in both of us to recognize that the freedom of the moment was terribly important. Maybe just like the wildflowers blowing in the wind as we looked out the window, there was, I think, the sense in both of us that freedom was a part of this. And this trust that if we gave it enough space, that something would walk up and speak to you.
Yes, inexplicably.
Yeah.
That's where the mystery lies.
Yes.
I remember that Madeleine L'Engle used to joke. She'd look at me directly with all seriousness in her face and say, there are 3 essential rules for writing the perfect novel. And the first time she said that, I practically dropped my bowl of spaghetti. I was so focused on listening to what she said. So she said, there are 3 essential rules to writing the perfect novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are.
That's probably true.
And I think it conveys some of this.
Just adding to what you said, just let it be. Trust the storyteller. Trust the universal storyteller in you. Trust the hairs on the back of your neck that when you mention swimming in the sea and seeing a whale, that all of a sudden the back of your neck tells you that that is a really good idea. If you only trust your brain, you may have a very compositionally powerful piece, but you may have missed the beating heart. And that is what we're going for, is the beating heart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what you say applies to every genre of story, too. I was doing a quick count over the weekend before speaking with you, and of my 32 books, Patti, 27 of them were edited by you. And so we've been in this a lot, and that includes picture books for young children. That includes big novels and trilogies and quintologies. It includes nonfiction books, chapter books, all the different forms of storytelling.
Yep.
But in every case, you have those elemental principles of finding that seed, that baby, that core value in the story, protecting that and nurturing that and finding the way to let that grow and help it grow in the midst of a good, riveting story that makes you lean forward and care about the characters and the place and what's at stake.
Yeah, I think that comes back to transcendence again also. So that you're going there, right? You have put your piece of paper down and you got your pencil. You're going to write this story. For example, Tom wrote a story of climbing a Colorado mountain. And Tom, I'm from Michigan. Remind me of the name of that mountain that our young person climbed.
Long's Peak.
Right? So Long's
You're talking
Peak.
about high as a hawk.
I am indeed. And so he's got a piece of paper and a pencil, and he's going to write this story about this little girl that accompanied the actual explorer of the mountain. But where he's going in his heart, tell me if I'm right or wrong, he is going for a transcendence. Lucky him that it's the top of a mountain.
Right, exactly. A fitting metaphor.
It helps, but he's the one that's got to etch it.
Yeah.
He could also let the story stop at a plateau. He could also get to the top of the mountain and forget to sit there long enough. So it's his job, in a sense. If he wants transcendence, it's his job to get to this peak moment and to let all of us have it. To suddenly say, look, this is not just my story, it's yours too. Do you feel that? Right? You're speaking to the reader.
Right. And if you're extremely lucky, you have a wise editor at your side to ask those questions along the way. You know, one of the things that you're reminding me of is that on the journey here, as a writer, as a storyteller, one of the best parts is that it makes us more alive in the rest of the world and the rest of our lives, because we have to be fully aware of our inner life and our inner self and our core values and our emotions and our distresses and our frustrations and our devastations and our triumphs and our moments of wonder, our sense of the miraculous, our sense of humor, all of those things. We have to be aware enough to employ and engage in just the right balance. And at the same time, we're encouraged to be aware of what's outside ourselves, right?
Yeah.
To notice how people move and act and talk and gesture as I'm gesturing right now. Because I can't help it. You've got me so impassioned. But I feel noticing clearly the world around us and the world inside us is essential to being a good storyteller. But it also is a wonderful way to be alive in the world.
You know, I have run across a word that really is not my word. At least it was not ever the way I expressed it. But my young people, the word mindfulness. So they are more mindful. They're actively mindful. And it is exactly what the author has to be. The author doesn't just look at the sweep of something. He or she doesn't just look at Johnny Jones walking out on the dock and seeing the moon drop, or however that's expressed, right? That's not what happens. The author looks closer. The author looks for color, for specificity, for the tiniest detail, that this is authentic. That's why we believe that a story is authentic, because the author has captured the detail of it. It's a wonderful world, and it's up to us as writers and editors to notice it.
That's so true. And it's not just noticing Johnny out there in the moonlight, right? It's noticing what's going on inside of Johnny. What is his emotional struggle here? Why is he feeling the way he's feeling? Lost or alone or excited or doubtful, however he's feeling. The scene around him is a way of illuminating that. And as you and I have talked about so many times, often the very best way to convey that authenticity is through indirection, right? It's not head on. It's not to say Johnny was feeling upset because. It's really to indicate that by the way he walks, his posture, the way his feet shuffle on the ground, or the sounds overhead, or what is he seeing that's perhaps a reflection of moonlight on the water? And how can we evoke the feelings that he has in the reader?
Yeah, I think this is true. And I think this is a big goal of writers. This is a big way to write, in a direction to go in. I'll tell you one thing I've discovered. If you're at a certain part of the story and you've just brought it alive by the exquisite detail that you're conveying and the indirection, what have you, sometimes in order to get your character in a certain direction, there needs to be a declarative sentence. Mostly it's the other, but sometimes there's the declarative sentences that say, look, this is where we're going.
Yes.
This is what happened. So sometimes it can be an opinion, sometimes it can be a direction, but it kind of reflects on what you've just said.
Yes. You know that book we both read a year ago of Russian short stories?
I love it.
Yeah, that was just a beautiful example of exactly what we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And in several regards. Yes.
Back to the hard labor of writing. What are your thoughts about how to make characters truly come alive? What advice would you give about that?
One of the best short stories is a short story by George Saunders called A Victory Lap. It's just an excellent short story. It takes the story from three different points of view. A young girl getting ready to go to a ballet class, a young boy who is kind of a nerd. He's just been a nerd. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't stand up. And another young boy who is about to break into a house. So what's so excellent about it is, first of all, the voices. So whenever we talk about character, but not only when we're talking about character, but when you're talking about creating character, write with voice. Understand what voice is. It is not compositional. If it looks compositional, subject, verb, object, or even a prepositional beginning, it probably does not contain voice. Voice is aberrant. Voice is exclamation. Voice is fragments. Voice follows voice, the way you speak. And the reader hears you. When you use voice inside a story, the reader hears you, and there's an authenticity to that.
Right. It's as if we're all sitting around that campfire eons ago, sharing stories about the saber-toothed tiger that I saw on the way, or what happens after someone dies, or whatever the story. I often advise aspiring writers on this point: sit down in your mind and imagine you are telling the story, not writing it. You are telling the story to someone you know and trust, a friend, someone in your life. What gets them leaning forward, wanting to hear that next sentence? That's part of the gateway into finding your own voice.
I'm glad you're saying it to young writers. Sometimes when I look at the sheet of regulations that school districts put out for their young people, I have yet to see somebody have a page on voice, and yet there's nothing more important when it comes to creative writing. So absolutely what you've just said. In fact, you could even add, because you would, Tom Barron, you would add passion to it. And so you need to feel the passion of the characters. So the point is that if you follow the way you really speak, it's going to be aberrant. So Catcher in the Rye. If you look at the first page of Catcher in the Rye, you don't need any kind of a how-to book. It's all there. The aberration is there. The alliteration is there. The passion is there. Who is he talking to? He's probably talking to a therapist.
Yes.
So when Tom said, imagine you're talking to somebody you like, make sure that somebody who you're talking to is you would tell them anything. It's that kind of a friend. It's not your Aunt Matilda. You can't trust her. She probably will tell your mother. No, it's somebody who you feel rawly about. You would tell him you're not happy about something, you are happy about something, and you want the person who's listening to you to know. So I just absolutely agree with you. I think that's wonderful advice.
That's part of why I envision someone you trust. But you're right. You need to be able to access your emotions, your doubts, your fears in that presentation, as well as your exhilaration and your passion and your dreams. And here's one of the wonderful things about voice. It's not only the voice of the storyteller we're talking about. every single character has a voice.
Yes.
And I would argue every place, if well crafted, has a voice. So we need to listen not only to the way we are telling the story to an imagined audience, we're also needing to hear the voices of our characters and places fully and convey all that.
The difference in voices, you may see it even more in the dialogue. Like when they're talking to each other, you should be able to hear the difference in voice there. You know, the other voice is the narrator. In a book like yours, sometimes the narrator has a very distinct voice.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and in fact, remember the transition when I was working to get that book 1 of the Merlin saga. By the way, having no clue that it would become not just 3 books, but 5 books, but 13 books.
Yeah.
But I was really struggling with telling this story in the third person as a narrator. It just wasn't coming through enough. And then in a conversation with you, I realized, this needs to be told by the boy himself. This needs to be Merlin emerging in his own self and his voice. And then the trickiest part for me was to leave behind the voice of the elder Merlin, which I could hear really loud and clear. It was so easy to channel that language. That's why the opening paragraph of The Lost Years of Merlin, Book 1, is the voice of the elder Merlin reflecting on it. And then I transition into the boy himself. And he's the one who tells his story all through those 5 books of the young Merlin adventures.
Isn't it wonderful, the choices that we have as writers? Just wonderful choices, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes the narrator talks to the reader like Kate DiCamillo in Despereaux, right? She all of a sudden just pulls up and starts talking to the reader.
Yeah.
She hasn't done that before, I don't think.
No.
Shirley does it in that book. So you have these wonderful choices, but you come to know your character, your narrator, what you don't want. You don't want to write a composition as if it were voice. What I sometimes say is you are reporting. You think you're a newspaper reporter and you're reporting. That is not the same as telling a story with voice.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. I try in getting to know characters, Patti, I start where it's easiest for me, which is in my left brain, right hand description, rational description. Who are these people? What do they look like? What do they dress like? What are their customary mannerisms? What's their place in their society?
Yeah.
Where did they grow up? Get a visual image of them very clearly, and then go deeper than that. And go deeper than that, and go deeper than that, and deeper than that, and find out, what are they afraid of? What do they dream of? What are their highest hopes and their deepest fears? And then ultimately at the very end, in this ongoing conversation, because that's how it feels, I ask a character, okay, now what is your deepest secret? And when I hear that question answered, almost always it's something I never thought of. But the character is speaking to me then with an authenticity and a voice.
Yeah.
And that really informs the way I'll tell the story of that character.
You know, I think you're willing to walk with your characters. I was thinking as you spoke, some of the characters that I'm so fond of, and I've always liked Rhea, and I've always liked Halia. I mean, they're such magical characters. Maybe it's because they're, both female. I'm particularly related to them, although I love the young men, so it's not that. And I love Bumblebee. I'm not in to say that right.
Bumblebee the jester.
Yeah.
Who can't get anything funny.
No, he's so pessimistic. Everything that comes out of his mouth is pessimistic, and
which in the end actually makes him funnier.
Absolutely. There is wit and humor in your books, and that is a major part of your books. And I absolutely adore when you let go to that.
I've had the great advantage of having 5 bright kids who are full of pixie-ish sense of humor and silliness and imagination. So there is plenty of humor around. But let's talk about that for a moment, Patti. Humor has a role beyond just making someone laugh, right?
Mm-hmm. Take that a little further. Yes.
Well, so could you speak about that, Patti? Because I know you've thought a lot about the role of humor and gestures, for example. What are you thinking about with the deeper side of humor?
Let me take one of them just for now. You know I love when the stones talk to each other.
Yes. Yes, that's in the ancient one.
Yeah,
Yes.
which I just absolutely adore. It's about a page and a half long. It's 2 stones kind of second guessing each other, and it's an absolute delight. However, there are occasions when all the way through literature, the so-called, you're calling it a jester, I might call it the fool. So that this character who is foppish and who is bumbling and who is maybe misspeaks, and you look at him and you might say, what a fool. But we know very well that the fool often is the one who is the speaker of truth. And so it's a very, very handy character. So not only are you being entertained by somebody like Bumblebee, but you also know, be careful, listen to him, because he may not be the fool. And of course, one of the early fools that all of us think of is Lear's fool. He was a wonderful fool. He steals the play every time it's produced because he's so funny and he is so true. Yeah.
Shakespeare absolutely knew how to use that tool.
Yeah, and you did too. You have humor all the way through every book. It's part of the aura. It's part of the makeup of your book. That's right.
Patti, let's change subjects a little bit to the subject of magic. And not just magic in fantasy. How do you see magic in stories? And what is its role? What does it elicit if it's done well?
Well, it's funny because as an editor of fantasy and as an editor of magic in a way, what I want for it to be is true. And I'm sure that you've read the essay, Tree and Leaf by Tolkien.
Yes.
And what he says, and I've looked at it recently, but what he says is to understand the world of magic, to portray it, you will go there by way of the primary world. So if, for example, you think of the first scene in The Hobbit, when Gandalf comes to visit the Hobbit, and he comes in, and if you look at just that page, you'll see that his smoke is spiraling. He hangs his raincoat up in the hallway. He sits down and he's going to have a cup of something, and everything about it has the detail of a fine Russian story. The detail. Why? Because Tolkien wants you to believe it's true.
Right.
So the access is the primary world and the detail of the primary world.
That's why the hobbit holes are so comfortable, right?
Absolutely.
And you feel that comfort, that coziness.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Imagine if those hobbits were just dreary old little dirty rodents. That's not going to make it.
No.
No, it's not going to make it. No, it's what are you doing to breathe life into your character? And I think that's where magic can happen, is if it feels authentic. And so there's a big stretch to that. You know, it can go all the way from Arthurian magic, and I do believe that this applies to Arthurian magic, all the way from there to a more contemporary magic, maybe even something like Charlotte's Web. That is a fantasy. You know, what makes it a fantasy? It's the humanity of it, right? It's the authenticity of it, of the, in a sense, primary world, primary emotions. Yeah. Does that answer?
It does. And there are variations on this theme, right? With magic realism, for example.
Look at that. Look how that works. There's a wonderful line from Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and maybe you remember it, when the ant is out in the, she's kind of a witch, she's kind of a disreputable ant, or certainly a grouchy ant, and everybody's a little bit fed up with her. But in any event, one day she's out in the backyard, and I think she's hanging up clothes, and all of a sudden a wind comes along and it simply blows her away.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you've got this ant flying through the air. I think she's still holding on to the clothesline. So, and that's often used as one of a major example of magic realism. Mm-hmm. There's no separation between the reality of the moment and the magic of the moment. But again, do you see how primary world that is?
Yes.
It's laundry. It's a laundry rope. It's Mondays when you do your washing.
Right. A Wrinkle in Time starts not on some other planet with the three witches. It starts in the kitchen, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Yes.
So it also is important in remembering this is how we deliver big ideas. We can set up the conditions, but we can't directly say the big idea, because then it's going to sound like a lecture. You want the reader to discover the idea. So if your point is that all of us have magic down inside ourselves, one way to convey that very big idea is to have a boy wash ashore without any memory or knowledge of who he is or where he came from. No memory at all. He doesn't even know his own name.
Yeah.
And to discover that not only does he have inside himself qualities like courage and loyalty and hope and the rest, he also has something truly magical that, if he takes care of it, can grow and swell and ultimately help him to make the world a different and better place.
Yeah.
That's how the metaphor gets across. It's by living with this lad as he survives each day and each adventure.
Yeah. Tom, I know you know this, but when an author takes a diminutive character, for example, this character, of course, we know this is young Merlin. I think what we're really saying when we write these books is, you are 8, you are 10, you are 12, you can make a difference. You're not as tall as your Anthony, your cousin or your brother who is 19 or has graduated from college. You're not as tall. No, you are important. You can make a difference. And I always felt that was one of your major ideas. You are small, but you can make a difference, that everyone makes a difference, and you can also. So it is Merlin washing up on the shore, but in a way it's your reader washing up on the shore and deciding who he or she is going to be.
That's right. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly felt washed ashore in my life at times, and I think most people do. And every child, no matter how small they are, but also no matter what their circumstances, how many obstacles there are in front of them, how many disadvantages they have, all children have a magic down inside if they can only have the opportunity to discover that and then allow it to grow. And that really is the idea. The metaphor of Merlin really is that idea.
Yeah. What is wonderful are the people who help it to be given to children. So it's the author who believes in it, who has the passion to say it once again in a new way. It's also the editor and the publisher, but it's also the librarian who puts the book in the hands of a child.
Yes.
Because not every child has parents who will put the idea in their hands. Right. And so this outreach is incredibly important. Do you remember Gary Paulson?
Oh, sure, the hatchet.
And you may have heard his story. Just to live was a problem for Gary Paulson when he was a young boy. And one day, and it was winter time, and he was outside in his village and there were bright windows, and it was a library. And there was a librarian in the window who beckoned him in because it was so cold. And he came into the library that day, and it was the beginning of a love affair with libraries and books, and in the end, writing. So, yeah, we're a part of a big thing, a big idea.
It's true. And you quickly learn if you hang out with children that children may be small, but they are a big person inside a small package.
Yeah.
You can even feel that with an infant in your arms. This is a big person,
Yeah.
just beginning
Yeah.
to sprout.
Yeah.
You know, I have to say that I've come to realize that every book I've ever written has a few key values, and one of them is this, the idea that every person matters.
Yeah.
And every person can make a difference.
Yeah.
You see that in Kate, in The Ancient One, at Heartlight. You see that in all of the Merlin books. You see that across the Great Tree of Avalon. And you see it in Anna, in Tree Girl. You see it in Promi and Atlanta, in the Atlantis trilogy. It's everywhere. Little Basil, who has to hide under the leaf of an herb and takes on the aroma of basil because of that, ultimately becomes a great and powerful dragon. But he has to grow in his own heart and his own wisdom to get there.
That's
the
right.
same is true with Shim. This is all about people of every description, even the most unlikely, making their way in life and discovering their power, their magic.
Yeah. I agree with you.
Nothing's more beautiful than that.
It's something for them to learn, and it's something for all the people that are around a child to know that they have the responsibility to share.
That's right.
Do you know what you can be? What would you like to be? Dream. Dream big. It's okay. Every human being needs a cheerleader, needs a cheering team.
That's the core of a good parent or a good teacher, I think, is listening to each child and hearing who is this person,
Yeah.
and then helping encourage that person,
Yeah.
believing in that person, and certainly not squashing that person,
No.
encouraging that person in every possible way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So this, of course, is, I hate to use the word mission because I sort of don't believe in didacticism. But if this living story is living, if it's authentic, it will convey, the reader will understand what the journey is. And I think that book after book, you had those journeys.
We had those journeys,
Well, I hope so.
Patti Gauch. Before we wrap up here, may I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
And I have enjoyed so much every moment of this conversation, Patti. But one last question. With all that you have seen over your years as a writer and an editor, as a storyteller in the truest, deepest sense, what advice would you have for an aspiring writer? Someone who feels that possibly there's a story inside them that they would like to share. What advice would you give that person?
As an editor, the first thing I looked at was voice. I picked the first page up and I looked at voice. And if you, the writer, understand voice, and if you follow voice, and that's kind of a unique idea. I think you can follow voice. You may have an idea that's kind of just growing, but if you put voice on it, you decide what the character is, and you begin to let that character talk and follow it. It could follow you to story. I think at a certain point, there's an image that seemed to help people that I work with. You know, I have these workshops, and so I'm still working with people growing. And it's the idea of a clothesline. The shirts and the pants and the things that you're hanging out are your chapters. So that clothesline is your narrative line. What is your narrative line? Do you know? And then the other part to that is, that's kind of the outside action. But there's almost a parallel clothesline that's interaction. And that's Aristotle. And that's the idea of a great human action. That is the inside stuff. What's driving this character is going to go. So that's the lower line. So that outer line and the inner line are working together to get to the climax we've been talking about, or the middle we've been talking about. You're still looking for authenticity. So you're looking for idea and authenticity. And I guess I'm moving around like this because I think first you get this and then you get this, and you keep at it until it begins to grow into something that's a real story. And you're courageous about what the story might be.
I would only add that you are disciplined enough to stay with it and help it grow. It's just like growing something in your garden. It doesn't happen automatically often. Sometimes blessedly it does if a seed blows in and plants itself. But what you normally have to do is till that soil and make sure there's plenty of sunlight and water and help it grow and give it support when it needs it. And that's the process that takes discipline. And I think discipline comes out of love, right? If you love your story, if you really, really care about it, and you just have to share it with the world, then you have the strength of discipline to do it.
You know what? Don't write it if you don't love it. Don't write it. Do something else. Because if you don't love it, you're going to get to chapter 3, and now it's going to be a drudgery instead of a joy. So what you choose is very, very important. And if you're lucky, you choose this thing and you think it might be a story, and then you kind of sit down and you envision it. Where could it go? How could it go? Right? So you begin to take a look at it as a whole. It begins to grow. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, Patricia Lee Gauch, this is why you have surrounded yourself with enduring stories, ones you've written, ones you've edited. I know from experience you really understand the full depths of that well of story. And what a joy to talk with you, my friend.
And a joy to talk with you, Tom Barron. Definitely. Absolutely.
As Shiv would say, certainly, definitely, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Patti.
My pleasure, Tom.
To everyone out there, let me just say thank you so much for joining us for Magic and Mountains. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, may you have magical days.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Magic and Mountains, the T.A. Barron podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information and to find all of TA's books, visit tabarron.com. Have a magical week.